Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
This patient has been abandoned by the doctors, the entire staff of the medical school. Brain research has long since been abandoned. For 5 years, the most accurate and cutting-edge instruments had failed to show any optimistic prognosis. Brain activity was not good enough to live and too good to die. To put it in ordinary human terms, such patients are called cynically in medical jargon a vegetable. They have to be cared for so that they don't go on. They're kind of alive. Even the hair, the nails grow, they have to be cut. Many actions are required every day to maintain the vital activity of a person who is neither alive nor dead, lying motionless like a plant in a pot. That's why no one from the family has come to this woman for a long time. Not even her own mother. It's been a long time since she's had ears. Who knows, maybe she also already gave her soul to God. But the medics were not interested in all this at all. And the patient was of purely scientific interest. Into such wards were taken students, interns, and young novice doctors, resident to learn, take blood, put a catheter, and integrate. In case of respiratory failure, not much else. In Vanessa's room, that was the name of a young, hopeless woman. Very much spent a lot of time a big red cat, rolled even huge size, with large ending tasseled ears and fluffy long tail. And clever, observant muzzle-less inhabitant of the institute was called Marcel. Where did he come from and how did he take root here? History is silent, but only and the oldest residents of the institution could not remember how and when they first saw Marcel. According to a common belief, he had always lived here. There was a legend in the institute that when God knows how many years ago his master was lying here in a coma. The cat somehow saw where his missing person was and managed to follow him to hide in the ward. After a while, of course, he was discovered and wanted to chase him away. But the cat turned out to be stubborn and very, very smart. How many times did they chase him away? And he came again and again, penetrating into the ward of the owner, in every possible and impossible way. In the end, they gave up on him. Let him live. The cat even turned out to be of some use. There were huge rats in the basement of the institute, which for many years no one could take out. Not poison, not traps. And Marcel was able to cope with the monstrous rats, because the institute was an institution, although medical, but still not as public as an ordinary clinic or hospital. The cat was left on the staff and even put on a sort of allowance. So he walked around. Now it was important to walk in the corridors and wards without disturbing anyone. He never climbed underfoot, did not tear or destroy anything, and quietly slept peacefully somewhere in a corner or sat on the windows and looked at the street. Sometimes he disappeared for a few days, but every time he came back gradually, Red Marcel became a real symbol of the Brain Institute. Soon another strange quality of the cat became clear. If he decided to settle for some time in the patient's room, it meant that something was bound to happen there in the near future. Usually such a patient left this sinful world forever. Less often there was a complete nullification of vital signs, and brain activity was reduced to a minimum, or even ceased to be recorded at all. In such cases, the patient was disconnected from the machines. And the final outcome was the same as in the first case. To the questions of relatives, who often came to the patients transferred to the institute, about the possibility of full recovery, doctors and other staff answered evasively, averted their eyes, and in every way avoided the need to tell the truth. And the truth was that if a person came here, he would meet his end here in a year or 10 years. But no one ever returned to life here. No one ever came back, because only the most hopeless were brought here, who couldn't be helped. The strange thing about Marcel's current behavior was that from the very first day of Vanessa's arrival, he had not just taken a liking to her room, but had tried to communicate with the woman in every possible way. Every now and then he climbed onto her bed. He sat or slept next to her for hours, pressed against her body. Sometimes he touched her paws gently, her hand or her face, and even managed to do so. And like a dog licked the cheeks and closed motionless eyelids of the patient. Why did our Marcel love her so much? The staff asked each other. Who can tell? He won't say. But it's strange that he's always trying to get close to her. She must have been a kind woman. Maybe she liked cats. There were all kinds of theories, from comic to tragic. But the fact remained. Marcel was clearly showing the patient signs of his feline attentions. Vanessa had been at the Institute for almost 3 years, and before that she had been in one of the capital's clinics for 2 more. In the first year of her stay here, her mother, still quite attractive young middle-aged lady, often came to see her. She sat in the room for long hours, sometimes crying. Sometimes she read aloud to her daughter or told her something. But the day came when her visits suddenly ended. And for 2 years, no one had visited Vanessa. Her medical records said she was 26 when she was admitted. Married. No children. Husbands never even saw her here. And rumor had it that he was somehow involved in the accident that had left the girl in such distress. As if her mother, when she was still coming, had once said in passing to one of the nurses that if it hadn't been for him, her daughter would be alive and well now, as it happened. Nobody really knew, and nobody wanted to know. And so time passed, day by day, week by week, month by month. In the fragile body of Vanessa was still smoldering and terrifying candle of life, but still not gone completely. Everything changed by an unexpected incident that happened one clear spring day. This day was talked about for a long time afterwards, told to the newcomers. Discussed, wondered, argued. It happened on April 4, and as it turned out, it was also my birthday. Hopeless patience. At the Institute came a young girl, beautiful, friendly, and asked the staff permission to go to the room Grigorieva. Of course, the girl was asked who she was and who the patient was. And she called herself her own sister. "My name is Cindy. We are sisters by father," she explained to the medics. I only recently found out I had a sister. At first I was happy, and then when I found out about her, I was upset that I wouldn't even be able to talk to her. A gloomy shadow came over the girl's face. But I decided to come anyway, at least to tell her that I am there, that I wish her recovery. Do you understand? What if they can hear everything? Come in, of course. The nurses nodded to her. She's in Ward 6. The girl thanked them and walked down the corridor to Ward 6. Red Marcel jumped out of bed and began to moo and show signs of joy and attention. "Oh, Kitty." The girl was surprised. "He's so cute. He looks just like my Betty. What's your name? Where did you come from?" They're not supposed to have cats in hospitals. Of course they don't. The nurse who came to change the catheter answered her. But this one's been around for a long time too. Everyone's gotten used to him. It's like he's one of our own. We feed him and love him. Sometimes you dream about being upset when you come to work. Look, Marcel is already running on his knees. They stick out. Will start his song when you warmly caressed him, and on the soul becomes warmer. The girl smiled clearly. "Well, you're a good kitty. But now go on. I need to talk to my sister." You see, Marcel seemed to really get the point. "Sweetie." So he delicately left the room. And the nurse went out, but she couldn't help but overhear through the open crack. What would a girl talk about? The conversation was one-sided, but very interesting. "Hello, sister," the girl said sadly. "It's a shame to see you like this. It's doubly unfortunate that such terrible circumstances brought us together. And we knew nothing about each other. If only I could have guessed, then Vanessa. Will you ever forgive me?" The girl cried. And after a minute, having coped with emotions, she continued, When I found our picture, my grandmother at first did not understand anything at all. I asked my mom, and she didn't say anything either. She said she didn't know who it was. I don't remember anything, but I wore it properly, and she finally told me everything. I had to tell her, if she had known that my grandmother had this picture in her apartment, she would have thrown it away long ago, and I would never have known about you. My dear Vanessa, how much I want you to get better. I'd do anything to make you forgive me. Would you? You know I'm not seeing him anymore, and I don't intend to see him ever again. Really? Trust me, please. I need a sister so badly. I've always wanted a little sister. It's so great. A soulmate is like a friend, only 1,000 times better. And we do everything together. We go shopping, we go out, we go on vacations together. I have a car. It's been 3 years since I got my license, and I'm pretty good at driving now. I'm begging you, Vanessa. Wake up, I need you so much. I don't have anyone else left. My mother doesn't count. I can't even see her. I can't even talk about him. I'm telling you, I wouldn't look at him again. When I think of it, it makes me shudder. I'll come back often, very often. You get well, please. You have a lot to live for, don't you? But goodbye. Oh, I forgot to tell you, you have a beautiful ginger cat in your room. He looks very familiar to me. He looks like Betty. First he lived with me and then with my grandmother, because my mother is allergic to cats and dogs too. She's allergic to everything. I think the girl grinned bitterly, even at me. After my father died and I left, she only became even more embittered. All right, I'll tell you all that later, when you come to your senses. I believe it. I really believe it's gonna happen. It can't be otherwise. I can't live with that kind of guilt, and you have to believe. You're Vanessa the Beautiful. You have a name, dear. Next time I'll tell you about our father and the picture and everything. Now I have to run. Otherwise I'll be late for work. She poked Vanessa on the cheek and left the room with a quick step. The nurse pretended to be diligently washing the plastic panel, with which the walls of the Institute clinic were sewn. Goodbye. Friendly, Cindy told her. I'll be back soon. Goodbye, the nurse said. You're welcome to come. Soon the news that Vanessa suddenly had a sister spread throughout the Institute. Where did she come from? The staff wondered. And why were they so interested in her? In fact, no longer a living person, strange as it may be, and they would not be able to communicate with each other now. Everyone summarized, it's too late for that. I should have met my sister sooner. However, on the same day when the hopeless Vanessa was visited by her sister, a very strange thing happened. The instruments recorded an unprecedented surge of brain activity. Just Everest, something appeared on the screens of monitors, immediately gathered for an emergency meeting of doctors and Professor's eye. At the villa that it is necessary at the sick round-the-clock doctor's post put up just in case. Because none of them had ever seen such a thing with their own eyes before. And what was the amazement of the young Anna resident from the first year, when late in the evening at the post, where she and the nurse's interns peacefully drinking tea with candy and rusks, literally rushed Marcel, with her long tail and a trumpet and desperately shouting, "What are you doing?" Asked Anna, "Are you a rat? Came in here with the rats? Is he the one who can kill them in no time?" "No, something else is troubling," said the elderly head nurse. "But let's go to the doctor in room 6. "Why?" The nurse marveled. "There are sensors there. If anything happens, a signal will be sent to the post." Let's go. The signal nurse insisted. The one Anna was talking about. Forbidden at the post, when they had already opened the doors to the ward. Of course, the medics are experienced, cynical people. Even to surprise them with anything is extremely difficult. But even they were amazed when they saw that the patient had been in a deep coma for 5 years. Opened her eyes. Betty, weak? With one lip, she said to Marcel, who ran back with the men, jumped on her bed, and with all his might began to rub against her face, rattling like a tractor basket. That was the end of her strength for the day, having returned from the shaky dreamland, and Vanessa closed her eyes again. Anna, in shock and panic, began to call all her colleagues, telling them what she and Nancy had just seen and urging them to come immediately. Of course, it didn't take long for the Institute's team to arrive. It's just amazing. You are not the final verdict of an important professor heading the Department of Neurology. We are now recording a state very close to normal sleep. Well, colleagues, it looks like we're on the verge of a major discovery. We need a 24-hour study of this phenomenon. When the newly appointed nurse Vanessa reappeared on the doorstep a couple of days later, she was literally taken in a ring and pelted with questions. What she said to the patient, in what tone of voice, what she brought with her, whether she had any substances with her that could affect the patient's condition. How did she even know she had a sister? How did she find her? Understand, my dear, we're not inquiring out of idle curiosity. The head doctor of the Institute, dumbfounded by the attention of everyone, was interpreting her. This unique case is so unusual that even the smallest insignificant detail can be an important factor, a catalyst for a change in the patient's condition. It is your duty to science to tell us everything you know. Please, Cindy smiled openly. I have nothing to hide. If you want to know my story, I'm ready to tell it. Only it may take quite a while. It's a complicated story. That's all right. The doctor said enthusiastically. Do you mind? If we record your story on audio? No. Good. And for your convenience, tell it like you're talking to a friend. We'll assign you a friend. We'll tell you. Oh, Anna, of course. She's the one who found your sister when she suddenly came to. But I'll leave you girls to your coffee and goodies. Get to writing. The sooner the better. We should probably start with the way things happened. Cindy said thoughtfully, looking at Anna. It's a little inconsistent, but it won't work any other way, she summarized. So it was like this. 6 years ago, I met a very handsome man. Cindy started and smiled embarrassedly at her interlocutor. You know, I was blown away by him. But it happens when you see a person and realize at once that it is exactly the one you need. And so, I met him by accident. In the pharmacy, I went to buy medicine for my grandmother. She was all sick, and he also ran in just for a minute to pick up the internet order and so hurried somewhere something. In principle, in this pharmacy, internet orders without queuing always give out. But that day they did not have a second saleswoman and had to cope alone. And there was a clue. He started asking everyone to let him through quickly. He said he was late for the hospital and needed his medicine badly. Well, I took pity on the man and said go ahead of me. I was the second one and the crew had already started to get indignant, and he smiled at me like that and I melted. As it turned out later, it was for nothing that this man was so right and handsome at first sight. But the heart, as they say, can't be ordered. He took his order and offered to give me a ride to wherever I needed to go. I didn't have far to go, but I agreed without thinking, because I fell in love with him at first sight. We started dating, and at first everything was great. I flew like on wings and imagined that finally found the guy of my dreams. In the summer, he offered me to go on vacation with him in Turkey. God, I was excited until 3. Until the moment when in the Turkish airport accidentally saw in his civil passport stamp on marriage. We had an ugly scene. It's still embarrassing to remember. Screaming, a quarrel on the whole tourist bus had already arrived. We had to go to the hotel, and we're here to settle the relationship. All the tourists were probably laughing at us. But still at the hotel, he managed to persuade me to believe again. He said that he hadn't lived with his wife for a long time, and they had no children. She's horrible. She won't give him a divorce, and he doesn't know how to get rid of her. I was melting, of course. I had my ears back in the air, and he put even more noodles on them. As it turned out, she was nothing. And no children, because he didn't want any children categorically. And there was no talk of divorce either. He didn't even think of divorcing her, and only had fun with me. But I found all this out much later when one day with another he caught him. He was giving his wife horns, double horns or even multiple horns, most likely. I was so upset. I just didn't want to live. I don't even know how he expressed it now. I don't even know anymore. It wasn't until some time after we parted that I saw a small article in the newspaper in the Criminal Chronicles section that a woman had been injured after falling on the tracks from a moving train. The suspect was her husband, and a picture of him was present. It featured none other than my former lover. I was not lazy and went to the investigator who was handling the case. I wanted to find out all the details and at least something to help this poor woman. After all, I already knew perfectly well the deceitful nature of her husband. It turned out that this young woman of my age, Vanessa, lived until recently with her husband in the Washington region, and at the time of the accident was pregnant. When I learned about it, I began to suspect that this scoundrel had pushed her out of the car on purpose. He 1,000 times himself told me that he hates small children, and in general, no children never want to have. And if he got me pregnant, he'd be on the court. I was such a dope at the time that I didn't even pay any attention to what he said. So what? So he doesn't want kids yet. It could be explained by a heightened sense of responsibility. That's right. You need to stand on your own 2 feet first, and then have children to provide for them properly. But after it was revealed that he was married, I realized he didn't want kids at all. And he didn't even hide his horrible attitude to this issue. He said that if his wife tried to get pregnant, he would make sure that nothing would come of it. That's how the investigator was back then. He listened to me and said he believed me. But do I have any proof of what I said? Words can't be used to prove anything. I had no proof, of course. So they let him go. They dropped the case for lack of evidence. His wife was in a coma and couldn't say anything to anyone. What happened? I went to the hospital where she was lying for some reason. I don't know why I wanted to look at her, do something for her. So I came in, told her I was her friend. They let me into the room during visiting hours. You know, she's changed very little since then. Oddly enough, her skin had yellowed. And then I was struck by the way she lay there. Beautiful, like a sleeping beauty who sleeps in her crystal coffin and waits for her fairy prince to come and wake her up with a kiss. But there was no prince on the horizon. There was only an unfaithful husband who wanted to send his beauty to the other world with his own hands. I was 100% sure of that. Even called him, then looked for specifically to say in his eyes that I think about him naively thought that maybe he will be ashamed, and he will repent, or at least say something to give himself away. I even thought about recording his words on a tape recorder, but he wouldn't even return my calls, and then his number was unavailable. He must have changed it. The doctors told me that Vanessa had lost her baby and would never have children again. Of course, after that kind of traumatic injury, no kids. She survived, but she wasn't getting any better. And soon the doctors told me that there was almost no hope left. I felt so sorry for this strange young girl, and a huge sense of guilt that I was involved in her tragedy did not leave me in nod. But here and in my family there was a grief my beloved grandmother, who was all sick, fell and broke her femoral neck. The hospital did what they could. She was told that surgery in her case is not indicated, will not help, and the chances that will heal too is not much. She was already old. My grandmother was the mother of my father, who had already died a few years ago, and my own mother refused to take care of her. She never loved her. She and her father had a very complicated relationship. I had to take a leave of absence from the institute and sit with her, because we had no money to hire a nurse. If my mother had, I would never have done it. For 3 months, I tried to cope with the pain and fear that tormented both my grandmother and me. The nurse of the hospital came and gave her injections. Then she taught me, and I myself began to give her both medications and vitamins to keep her bones better. I gave her oxygen cushions. I made them. I inflated balloons with her to develop her lungs. Lungs are the first thing to fail in bedridden patients. What am I telling you? You're a doctor. You know better than I do. So I thought she was doing better, that she was going to get better. But after 3 months, she just faded away quietly and died practically in my arms. She signed her apartment to me, and I have long since moved to my grandmother for good from my mother, and practically stopped all relations with her. But when I was a few months after my grandmother and death began to make repairs in the apartment, I came across an old cardboard box on the mezzanine, where 1,000 years no one has not climbed. In it were various old documents, letters, and photos. I became interested, and I slowly dismantled them. I kept some of them for memory and threw them away for uselessness. Among others, I saw one photo, which surprised me very much. In this picture sits my grandmother. From her, I am still very young, probably about 3 or 4 years old. Another girl is about my same age and looks a lot like me. But the most interesting thing about this same photo, and my dad is in a wheelchair, as he usually is. He's been handicapped since I was born, for as long as I can remember. And this little girl is sitting in his arms, and my grandmother is next to him on the couch, and I'm standing right there myself. I was very curious who this girl was. On the back of the photo, there was an inscription written in pen and almost erased by time. I am Chuck, Cindy, and Vanessa. And the year is written, as I realized, according to the date it seemed that I was 4 years old then, and the girl looks like me, hardly much older. I started to look further. I found another photo. Again, this same Vanessa is already older, stands at the tree, apparently in kindergarten, and grandmother's hand on the back is written Vanessa, 6 years old. What kind of girl is so weird that my own grandmother kept her baby pictures? After all, one only does that with photos of one's children or grandchildren. That thought struck me like a bolt of lightning. And I guessed that Vanessa must be my grandmother's granddaughter too, and therefore my sister, most likely a cousin. I certainly don't have any cousins, no one at all, except me. My parents have only me, and after me they could not have children, because my father before my birth was very badly hurt in a railroad accident. And the circumstances under which it happened are strangely similar to those in which my present acquaintance Vanessa found herself. But about her father and mother I will tell you later a little. And now about how I saw about my sister. So I was sure that the little girl Vanessa, whose picture I found in my grandmother's old box, is my cousin, or maybe a third cousin. Apparently my father had siblings. Here's the weird thing though, neither he nor my grandmother ever told me anything about it. I don't think my mother had any sisters or brothers. I don't think my grandmother would have kept pictures of my mother's nephews. So we had to find out whose daughter Vanessa was. I couldn't ask my father or my grandmother. I had to go to my mother's house in the hope that she would tell me something. It wasn't easy, as we hadn't spoken to each other for several years. But I found the moral strength to call her and ask her to meet me. Come, she told me. I hope you haven't forgotten the road yet. However, at our meeting, which was not in a kindly family atmosphere, and there were, of course, their reasons, Mom didn't deign to tell me anything. How do I know what kind of child she was? She looked at the picture. Your father never told me anything about his family. And neither did your mother-in-law. But you don't know, maybe he had brothers or sisters, maybe he did. But he didn't talk to anybody. Well, of course he didn't. You didn't even let him out of the house. I couldn't take it. Did you come here to accuse me again? Mother was indignant. Well, in that case, you can call off the noise from here. I'm not ready to listen to these far-fetched accusations for the 100th time. Okay, I sighed. Since you won't admit the obvious facts, I don't think we have anything to talk about. I have nothing to admit. My mother shouted at me, "You're just as stubborn as your late father. You're just as stubborn as your late father." So I couldn't get anything good out of her. I was thinking how I could find out about the twig, and I couldn't think of anything. A friend told me about my predicament. She is a lawyer, knows a lot of things. She advised me in the registry office to contact, to request information about relatives, to say that it is necessary for the registration of inheritance. I'd, of course, all the documents confirming kinship in my hands. There were both the death of my father and grandmother. But I did so. I went to the city registry office. From there, I was sent to the regional, and there they said that the request will need to do on all their internal base. And it's quite long. I wrote all the necessary application, paid for the search, and for the form. So I waited for months. I waited and finally waited. With trembling hands, I unfolded the envelope and took out a one-sheet certificate, which stated that my grandmother had one only son. That is, my father. But he himself had 2 daughters. Imagine, I thought that Vanessa was my cousin, but it turned out that she had another mother, and we have the same father. She herself turned out to be a few months older than me. How it came out that my father, better and more correct than whom I have never met in my life, abandoned a woman at this stage of pregnancy and married my mother, whom, as I knew perfectly well, never loved at all. I couldn't understand it, but the fact remained. I had a sibling, so-called children, who share only a father. I really wanted to find her, of course. But I was stumped and couldn't think of anything to find Vanessa. So again, I asked a lawyer friend for advice, and she found me a person who helped people in such situations. I looked for information through social networks, through some closed archives. For a week, I already had all the information about my sister, where she lived, where she studied, and so on. And most importantly, her address and phone number. I was jubilant. I dialed the number right away. I didn't even think about what I'd say to her. "Hello, I'm your aunt, or rather your sister. Would you like to meet me?" But I didn't have to say anything because Vanessa's number was unavailable. For days, I tried calling her, messenger, and social media. To no avail. Desperate, I drove to the address where she was supposed to live. Called, knocked. No one even opened the door. But a neighbor, an elderly woman with suspicious eyes, came out of the apartment next door. The kind of woman who usually knows everything about everyone, so why make a fuss? "What?" she asked me with a look. "I'm looking for Vanessa. You probably know her." "Well, let's just say I do." The neighbor nodded. "What do you want?" "She's my sister." I risked an unsteady piercing in front of this self-assured woman. "Like a sister?" The neighbor stretched out incredulously. "What kind of sister are you that you don't know what happened to her?" "Why?" "In fear?" I asked and covered myself with Murakami. Painfully that he and the neighbor was nasty. "And the fact that your sister is in the hospital," she said. "And it's been a long time. 4.5 years, I think." She moved her lips, counting to herself. "Yeah, it's probably been like that for a while." "And without movement, our Vanessa is neither alive nor dead." "Is that so?" "What do you mean she's not dead or alive?" I asked in a low voice. "And so in a coma," she sharply said the neighbor. "Didn't you hear? All the newspapers wrote all the internet and called her beloved hubby. He'll burn in hell forever." She was cursing and cursing. She spit on the concrete floor of the entranceway. She was pushed off the train by a pregnant woman. "Oh my God!" I screamed, and my heart clenched and covered with a cold crust of terrible pain. God, yes, it was her. Of course, she agreed with me, neighbor. Who else could it be? "And you, girl, you're all white. Come here, I gave you some tea. You're very strange. You must be in trouble too." This good-natured woman who only seemed to be formidable. I sat in the kitchen for a long time, recovering from the shock, and she questioned me. And I told her everything I knew. And she told me a lot of interesting things too. It turned out that Vanessa, my lover's wife, and Vanessa from my grandmother's old photograph were one and the same person. That's how human destinies sometimes work out. Later it turned out to be Aunt Wendy. That's what she told me to call myself. She knew my late grandmother very well and was able to tell me a lot about her, my father, and my sister, whom I had never met, except for a couple of times when my grandmother brought her to see her father and a few visits to the hospital, where my poor sister was lying in a deep coma as an adult. Cindy's throat constricted, and she cried with grief and bitter memories. Anna resident began to comfort her, hoarded valerian in a glass of water. When the girl calmed down a little, she was able to continue her story. This is what she learned from a neighbor, who turned out to be also a good friend of her grandmother. Many years ago, before Cindy and Vanessa were born, their future father, whose name was Chuck, was already married to a nice woman. They had lived soul to soul for several years, but they had no children. His first wife was very worried about it all the time, going to doctors, and finally became seriously ill and died suddenly of cancer. The husband grieved without her terribly, all crying, and did not want to do with anyone. But time passed, which is known to be the best healer, and he met another woman, Vanessa's mother. With her they met for a while, and kind of serious plans for the future did not build. The thing is, she was married too. Relationships with him didn't really work out, so she sought solace with other men and found it with Chuck. It was around this time that Chuck's attention sought and gained. Eventually another woman, Cindy's mother. This relationship with two women at the same time lasted several years, and after a while one of them, Vanessa's mother-to-be, told Chuck that they would no longer see each other as she wanted to rebuild her relationship with her husband. The relationship with Lucy, Cindy's mother, he himself was already weary because she turned out to be a woman who was not very distant and very complicated, scandalous, and insanely jealous. One day, Chuck directly but tactfully told her that their relationship had reached an impasse, and he had no intention of continuing it. But Lucy was not the kind of person to lose the man she wanted, so she started a huge scandal, threatening Chuck with taking his own life if he didn't change his mind, or killing Wendy, whose existence she had somehow deduced. Chuck countered that he was over Wendy, and that relationship was not the reason he and Lucy were breaking up. But she listened to nothing, but only threw tantrums time after time, generously violent threats and endless complaints. Finally, she called Chuck and, pouring tears in a tragic voice, told him that she had news for him, and they needed to have a serious talk. Chuck was a human being, very intelligent, kind, and decent. He lived in Washington, D.C., and Lucy lived in the region. And when they were dating, he would take the train to her house. Oh, he didn't have to go to her that night. He didn't want to go to her that night. But if he promised, he had to keep his word. So it was pretty late after work. Chuck came to the station and sat, as always, on the suburban train to a small town near Washington, where his Lucy lived with her serious talk. Here's what she had come up with to tell him she was pregnant. Being a man of integrity, he would, of course, marry her. That's what she thought, and with good reason. And then we'd sort it out. Maybe she would get pregnant soon. If not, she'd say she'd miscarried. What do men know about these things? Chuck rode in a half-empty train, and sometimes looking out of the dark windows, behind which the houses of the field were passing and climbed to the usual Washington suburbs landscape. At his lab, he had spent a long day today, teaching students and working on his own experiment until late in the afternoon. Chuck was a talented and already quite well-known theoretical physicist in scientific circles. His career was rapidly taking off. He had been published in many serious publications, including some overseas. Last week, he had received a call from the Boston Institute of Technology. They offered cooperation and even a place in their department. That's a bit of a stretch. Who will let me go? Chuck thought, leaning on his elbow and cooling the tired van blades. Autumn rain. He could not have known, of course, that in a couple of years the Iron Curtain would fall and such opportunities would open up that scientists had never dreamed of before. But all that was still in the future. Right now it was necessary to settle the problem named Lucy, which did not want to liquidate itself. Chuck wrinkled his nose. Why had he been so attracted to her a while ago? Not much of a mind, after all. Appearance is also quite ordinary. And most importantly, and human qualities, far from outstanding ignorant to Order's shadowy primitive views. Jealous to the point of insanity. No, there's no way he's going to tie his life to her. The other thing, Wendy, that woman was much more to his liking. Kind, quiet, very feminine, and so reliable. Just the kind of life partner he needs to be a support and backup for him, who is always up to his ears in work. In your research, please don't touch me. Suddenly that muffled cry, full of fear and despair, reached him. It came from the vestibule of the small gap connecting the carriages. Chuck, as a man of integrity, could not stay away. He went to see what was the matter. It was still about 15 minutes to his desired station. The few passengers traveling with him at this late hour diligently pretended not to hear anything. Some pretended to be asleep, some actually dozed off, sitting by the dark window. Others did not even think of pretending and only whispered quietly among themselves, discussing what they had heard, or they moved their hoods tighter around their collars. I can find out what's going on here. He asked the three young, insolent-looking subjects who had crammed a young girl into the corner of the vestibule. What's it to you, Uncle? One of them turned around. I need more than everyone else. You'd better go back to the wagon, advised the other one in the warehouse. We have enough of us here already. You'll have nowhere else to go. And they all laughed. Leave the girl alone, demanded Chuck. Is this the way a well-bred man behaves? It's a disgrace. The three of you attacking a defenseless woman. And you're the one who's so righteous. Yeah, the first young man turned around. Took a good look at Chuck. For the last time, get out of here before you get the first one in the side. I'm gonna go to the driver now. And at the nearest station you'll be expected by the police. Decisively said Chuck, and already turned to leave through the vestibule in another car and go to the beginning of the train, but suddenly felt a sharp pain in his back just below the shoulder blade. His eyes went black. He was thrown to the floor and kicked for a long time. And then he was thrown out of the carriage, into the night at full throttle onto the hard gravel, railroad embankments, the buckle, the long belt, his coat. Chuck hooked himself into the slot of the carriage door, and this improvised rope dragged him behind the train all the way to the station where he intended to get off. To go to meet a woman he had absolutely no use for. Why didn't he come? You tell me. Lucy complained the next day to her closest friend. You have to rely on these intellectuals to keep their word. That's what he always says. The price of his word is a pittance. but I'll find him anyway. Mark my word, I'll get him out of the ground if I have to. You can't just walk away from me. What does she think she's doing? I wish I knew. I'm an honest woman, not just any woman. I've got a husband myself, but he's sparks in the socket. She's always trying to steal someone else's man. He's mine, and I don't intend to give him up. But Chuck, in spite of a whole reel of dirty curses, which he was endlessly showered with, and Lucy, in spite of 1,000 calls both at home and at work, was still not found. Lucy had already lost all patience and was ready to go to him herself, in order to tell the stubbornness who he intended to lead around his finger. Suddenly, another call was answered at the pulpit that Chuck had had an accident. He had been badly hurt in a railroad accident. What? Where? How? 1,000 questions whirled through Lucy's head. And now she's sitting in the hospital by Chuck's bedside, unable to remember herself, disfigured for eternity, but still alive. And next to him, just think of the nerve of that. The same Wendy with a living husband hanging around other men's necks. Quietly said Wendy, I sympathize with you. I found sympathy, grumbled the woman. You should go away with your sympathy. My husband is also quite ill. Wendy went on. I don't think I'll be able to come often. Take care of him, please. I can manage without you. Lucy sagged angrily and turned away, showing that she had no intention of continuing this silly conversation. After lunch, the doctor came, outlined the prospects. They were very disappointing for Lucy. Chuck would recover. His life is no longer in danger, but he will be confined to a wheelchair forever. What do I need him for now? Lucy resented it, addressing the same friend. A paralyzed invalid. What will I do with him? No, I don't want that kind of joy. Let Wendy take him or something. I don't care anymore. What a dumbass, going up against 3 bullies. Standing up for some strange girl, some whore, 100%. All these damn intellectuals are always meddling where they don't belong. I would have sat quietly, like all normal people, and gotten there without any adventures. Now he'll have to ride in a wheelchair all his life. Oh, my bitter fate. Lucy concluded rather inconsistently. She let a good man down and then took him away. That's why it always turns out so disgusting. And her friend sympathetically nodded and agreed. And Lucy wrote long and colorful descriptions of his hardships and torments. But we'll see, she said at the end. Maybe he'll come to his senses. Doctors aren't often wrong. But I don't want him crippled. That's what I'm telling you. A few weeks passed, and it became quite clear that the doctors were not wrong this time. Chuck recovered from the living wounds of severe bruises and numerous fractures. But the spinal injury was so severe that he never recovered from it. And for the rest of his life, he was confined to a wheelchair. But during those few weeks, Lucy discovered other equally shocking news. She really was pregnant. Chuck answers. Absolutely. There were no other men in her life at the time. God, what was I in for? She rocks from side to side in her small kitchen. For what? Now I'll really have to marry him. That harmonious cripple. But why the people? Her friend comforted her. Don't. It's better to have an abortion. If you do that, I will not take such a sin on my soul. Lucy objected with conviction. Even though I don't need a baby now. But I can't kill a living thing. That's not the way I was brought up. I don't want to raise it without a husband either. I don't want to be a single mom. It's a disgrace. No, it won't work that way. I'll have to tell him everything. And let him get married. Better a husband, Kalenka, than no husband at all. At least the child will realize he's fabulous. That's as bad as it gets. With this news, Lucy came to Chuck. On the day of his discharge, the man was shocked by the news, but at the same time pleased. He had already spared no expense to be a father, to hold his own son or daughter in his arms. It didn't matter. The main thing was to feel his continuation, to see with his own eyes his own flesh. With his first wife, they never managed to have children. I guess it wasn't fate. And what a capricious, willful fate is this very fate that tells him to tie his life to one like herself. Capricious, willful. What choice does he have now, though? Who else would fast on him, a cripple who doesn't enter? What was it that fate was punishing him for? Probably because he did not dare to make a choice and fooled 2 women at the same time. Such bitter thoughts overwhelmed Chuck, who had lost everything overnight. So he is an honest man and someone who has nothing more to lose. He made Lucy a proposal, and after a month they were already officially married and were waiting for a new addition to the family. Strange and sad, with the family, not one of the spouses not only did not love the other, but even did not respect and did not hide it. A new addition was expected in another family, Wendy and David. Her husband was to become parents a little earlier than Lucy and Chuck. On the due date, Wendy had a daughter named Vanessa. She was the only one who knew that the father of Vanessa was not her husband, but Chuck. 6 months after Vanessa was born, Wendy's husband died suddenly of a heart attack. He never found out that little Vanessa was not his daughter, and that Wendy's birth certificate listed a completely different man as her father. At this point, Vanessa's neighbor had to end her story because Cindy had to leave. She would otherwise be late for work. They agreed to meet again, and in half an hour, Cindy was already sitting in the subway and remembered what the neighbor could not know. But she knew very well. 2.5 months after the birth of Wendy's daughter, Lucy had a healthy baby girl. She was named Cindy. Little Cindy had a heart for her kind, intelligent father. She literally grew up in his arms. He used to wheel her cat back and forth around the apartment, while your nasty kid was yelling incessantly, shutting herself in her room and crumbling. The father was feeding his tiny daughter from a bottle, barely reaching to get the formula out and warm it up properly. But with one hand holding his baby girl tightly, he taught the little earring to walk by holding her hand and slowly holding his stroller close by. Then she herself learned to hold on to her father's stroller and waddled funny. While mumbling something later, she already pushed the stroller and father from behind, helping him with all her little strength. Lucy could hardly stand her husband. He annoyed her terribly. She didn't like the fact that she had to move furniture everywhere from that damned stroller. That he was only a man in appearance now and of no use to her. Although Chuck continued to work from home, writing scientific articles, friends even moved to their home some instruments, equipment, so that he could do experiments. But Lucy resisted this innovation with all her might. Only takes up space for nothing. Chuck offered to come to the institute from time to time and even promised to equip ramps so that he in a wheelchair could himself go up to the laboratory. But again, Lucy objected. There is nothing to travel so far, as I will carry you by electric trains. Who will load, how to get out, and we don't have a car. You haven't earned a car. Chuck tried to tell her that she could move to his apartment, that it's much closer to Washington. Yeah, sure, your tiny one-bedroom with a kid, your wife argued. Then maybe trade both our apartments for a 2-bedroom in the capital. And then what would we live on with you? We'll be interested to know. Now at least we get something from the tenants, and if we change it, we'll stay on the women. Lucy answered, You're not likely to start earning well anytime soon. And Cindy will grow up. Before you know it, she'll need a separate apartment. Her malicious irony choked Chuck, made him lose heart. He became uninterested in anything, and only little James was his only detachment. She was the only thing he tried to live for. That's why his wife's argument that the apartment would go to your daughter calmed him down a bit. In the days of Cindy on in childhood and adolescence, they sew and lived together, laughing and crying. Either hating, not understanding each other at a glance, figuring out what Cindy needed when she was funny at the snicker in her eyebrows demanding it, showing her chubby hand that brushed or butcher. Loved each other, of course, Cindy and the father. And her mother in general, Cindy later realized, loved no one, and never loved anyone but herself. By the time she was a teenager, her father looked like a deep old man, gray-haired and wrinkled. His back and legs ached constantly, but he still serviced himself, not even allowing his daughter to help him. And Lucy yelled, not hiding her anger. But how long were you going to sit there? By the way, there are 3 of us living here, and the toilet and bathroom for all one mom. But why are you crying like that? Cindy told her. It's hard on him. It's hard on him. The mother yelled at her daughter again. You think it's easy for me to live with a cripple all my life? Have any of you ever thought about me? Asked your mother how to help her? No, you both only think about yourselves. You don't need me at all. She left the bedroom, slamming the door. so that the thin partitions and the crunch shook as if from an earthquake, and the dishes in the cupboard bounced. Cindy, on the other hand, was knocking on his father's door. "Dad, how are you? Let me help you." "I'm all done." His father opened the door smiling. "Let's go make pancakes." On weekends, he always made great pancakes. Quick, tasty, without any of the irritation my mother always used to cook with. "I was always nagging you, I was always working as Cinderella." And my father did not grumble and was not angry quickly, for the dough quickly ran out on a flat griddle, deftly turning a thin pancake with a spatula, and then put them in a hill on a large plate. It's good. Sometimes, if there was any stuffing, leftover ground meat, some cheese and sausage, cottage cheese smelling in the fridge, he would wrap it up, and it was simply aerobatics. This long art Chuck was taught to his mother by his beloved grandmother. That was her full name, sometimes very rarely, when free time gave out, and her mother let go reluctantly, always with reproaches. Cindy went to see her in Washington, and even a few times, already a high school senior, drove her father there in late spring and summer, when it was possible to walk to the train without mud and ice. There, standing on the platform, she looked out for men who seemed stronger and kinder, and asked for help to load the stroller into the carriage, and then also to pull it out at the station. Volunteers were usually found even after this difficult procedure. Every time my father, ashamed and averting his eyes, gave them crumpled rubles. He couldn't bear to have strangers help him just so he couldn't feel obliged. Having thus reached the grandmother, all three of them drank tea with cookies and nuts with condensed milk. Another family specialty was finishing old photographs. But the ones Cindy had found, the old box at that, were definitely not there. It was, she was sure. They went for a walk along Boulevard and on to wherever else their eyes took them. Cindy loved those leisurely family walks in Washington. And now, as an adult, every time she visited those places, she was desperately sorry for her long-gone childhood, for her beloved and kind grandmother. Ah, how she would have liked to have a real soulmate. Always disgruntled, angry mother does not count. She never could talk to her, and she didn't like to go out. She always said, "I don't have time to go out with you. I've got a lot of work to do around the house," and she wouldn't let her father go outside. "Where are you going? I'm not going to push you in a wheelchair and drag you out." My father frowned and drove away, wheels squeaking, to the kitchen and sat there for a long time in the darkness, looking up at the dark sky. He often slept in the stroller as well, not daring to settle down next to his cranky wife on the bed, so as not to disturb her sleep unnecessarily. Cindy slept on the sofa in the large passage room. There she had her own corner, a desk, shelves of books, and a piano, which her mother never tired of reproaching. Why did we spend so much money? It's just standing there, gathering dust. Cindy, who graduated from music school at her mother's insistence. But she refused to go to the museum to study, despite all the quarrels and scandals. She only kept silent. She tormented them. Just as her ungrateful father reprimanded her mother so many years and money wasted. The idea is to go to music school after school. Get smart before it's too late. "I don't want to be a musician. I don't want to be a musician." Can you understand that? Cindy resented it, unable to bear her mother's reproaches and molestations any longer. "What do you want to be? What do you want to be?" "A dog's hairdresser," Cindy said. With a laugh, the mother asked, implying her daughter's strange, silly, in her opinion, hobby. Cindy had been shearing her toys since childhood, especially the doggies and kittens. Growing up, she began to learn how to cut their hair with her father's machine. Former colleagues at work mother then swore for 2 weeks, and all threatened to throw out on the street this crap. But Cindy and her father defended their furry pet. Not for long, though. The mother never really got sick with anything, suddenly allergic to those damn donkeys. And Betty, as the kitten was named, had to be sent to friends 6 months later. The interesting thing is that the young cat didn't stay with them long. Came back home through the whole town came and sat under the door asking to come in. What was to be done? Cindy decided to take him to his grandmother's house. Maybe Betty would like it better there. And so she and her father, loading the cat into a Ziploc bag, drove to Washington, coaxing their pet along the way. Not to be afraid and stay to live with his grandmother in that Washington apartment liked it, and he didn't run away from his grandmother. Up to a time when in a year and a half my father became seriously ill. He was taken first to one hospital, then to another, and finally transferred to Washington, to the city hospital. He was still registered in Washington, thankfully. And completely unexpectedly for all, in the open warm autumn evening window of the first floor jumped a huge red cat and went straight to the bed of his master. Important, striding, as if you were at home here. Betty, Chuck cheered, when the cat easily jumped on his bed. Where did you come from? My little friend? The cat flashed something in response, looking intently into his lover's eyes and rubbing his cheek with his warm and fuzzy head. Of course, he was kicked out as soon as he discovered such an unwelcome presence. But the cat persisted in coming back again, and again until Chuck was discharged home, and my father seemed to be doing much better. But on discharge, the doctors gave strict recommendations, a special diet, daily walks in the fresh air, exercise, oxygen cocktails, and most importantly, a whole handful of medications that had to be taken now for life. Where did we get all this money from? Lucy was indignant, having read the entire list of required medications. Let them not make it up. We'll buy this. And this too. We don't have money for the rest. Mom, Dad needs it. He needs it to live. Don't you understand? Cindy was indignant at that time, a 10th grade graduate. Oh, you're going to teach me a lesson, Mom said. But maybe you can earn money yourself. Since Cindy was so smart, she went to the only salon in their town at that time, where dogs and cats were cut, and she asked to help. The master, seeing how the girl deftly handled the machine, took her on as an unofficial apprentice. In a month, Cindy had already earned her first real money and bought her father almost everything he needed. And so it went studying, then the salon, working until the evening, then lessons, and again in a circle from prom dress and so on. No need for the nonsense of scrapbooks of all that celebration. Cindy refused, telling her mother that she'd rather let the money that could be spent on all this go to her father's medicine. Mother rather taught an angry face, but kept quiet and even bought something. It went on like that for part of the spring and all of the summer. Cindy worked in the salon and was reading and textbooks. To enter the academy was going to live at her grandmother's house and study, though her mother, of course, was against it. But by that time, Cindy had already learned not to pay attention to her protests. In August, she passed all the necessary exams, chemistry, biology essay. In September, worriedly, she found her name on the admission list. Hooray, joyful, I came home. Daddy, Daddy, I got in. Can you imagine? But the apartment was unusually quiet and empty. All the rooms were wide open. Father's stroller was empty. Mother was gone too. Cindy, with her heart, smelling bad, sank down heavily on the kitchen stool near the window, and so sat with her fist under her head, afraid even to move. An hour later, the mother returned worried. He frowned. You're already back. But how's it going? Mom, where's Dad? Cindy asked in a trembling voice. Dad. Her mother came into the kitchen, put the kettle on, and sat down at the table beside her. Your daddy's dead. God rest his soul. It was much later that Cindy, who then could not utter a word for the immense grief that had overwhelmed her. Reflecting on that terrible day, she recalled a strikingly strange inconsistency. Her mother, who had never been religious, said these words with a kind of satisfied relief. It was as if she had waited a long time for the opportunity to finally say it. Of course, Lucy had no regrets about her dead husband. 2 weeks after the funeral, smiling happily, she brought home some shy bald man and introduced him to her daughter. This is Nick. He is a very good, kind man and will now live with us. Cindy only frowned and slightly averted her gaze. And the very next day, while neither her mother nor her newfound Hill was at home, she packed her things and left to her grandmother and mother in that small, dusty, not particularly cozy 2-room apartment in a small town near Washington. Never came back. I'm gonna interrupt you girls. A little way into the residence room, where Cindy and Anna, a young doctor, were seated. Natalia Petrovna, the nurse who first believed the red-headed Marcel, came in and reached into the ward. Suddenly woke up about Vanessa. "There's a patient of yours." 6 woke up again. Nick said she could come in for a moment. Vanessa shrieked out of breath. Cindy whizzed into room 6. "Careful, she mustn't exert herself," shouted the nurse in the ward from the summer. Vanessa wasn't alone, of course. She wasn't left alone at all now. There was a doctor on duty 24 hours a day, and now the head doctor was here too. "There is someone here to see you," he said to Vanessa, who opened her eyes and looked at him with an absent look. "Do you understand me? If so, close your eyes for a moment." Vanessa did so, covered her eyelids and raised them again. Nick said, "Good enough. Then here's your visitor." And he waved his hand, inviting Cindy to come closer. She did so, carefully sitting on the edge of the chair by her sister's bed. Vanessa said to her softly, "Hello, I'm so glad." Suddenly, the patient's absent face was distorted with a grimace of pain and anger. "No," she said with an effort. "No, go away, Vanessa." Desperately, Cindy said, almost crying. "Why are you chasing me away? So girl out, please." Took her by the elbow, resident, "Then explain yourself when she feels better." Cindy sadly was forced to leave the room. "She doesn't want to see me," she said regretfully. "Why doesn't she even know me?" "God works in mysterious ways," she said with a shrug of her shoulders. "Maybe she doesn't know. Maybe she remembered that she was confused with someone else. It's been years. No big deal." Indeed, on reflection, Cindy agreed. "Let her get stronger first, then we'll get to know each other and talk." Vanessa was coming back to life at a breakneck pace. Within a week, she was talking quite well. In 2 weeks, she started to get up on her own, to walk across the ward to the toilet, and all the time she had a red, fluffy Marcel by her side. Vanessa called him Betty and claimed him as her own cat, except for this little discrepancy. The rest of her memories were perfectly fine. She remembered her name perfectly and generally everything about herself, her life. And as if it had happened yesterday, reliving the tragedy that had happened to her 5 years ago, there was only one thing she couldn't remember. How exactly had it happened? Why was it like that? Anna, the facilitator, asked her mentor, the experienced Nick. A psychological barrier. He explained, "It's very much like our patient's mind has blocked out the worst memories. So she'll never remember who did this to her. We can't know that for sure. Science doesn't know the answers to all of our questions yet. But the fact that the patient has regained consciousness, that all her body systems are working normally, and she remembers almost everything about herself, is an undoubted phenomenon and requires a long, detailed study. How long will she stay with us? It's hard to say." As always, Nick answered evasively. "Sometimes it happens that the improvement is only temporary, and then the patient suddenly regresses," complained Cindy, who had become very good friends with Anna over the past few weeks. "Every day through her, I found out all the news about Vanessa. She was no longer allowed to visit her sister herself for fear of the negative. The first reaction could be repeated and seriously harm the patient. Cindy therefore had only to wait. She threw all her energies into work, and also part-time, and worked hard. As in her youth, she sheared dogs and cats at home from a large bathtub grandma wedges. She made 2 rooms, a small bathroom with a sink toilet and shower, and a more spacious room, even with a window above overlooking the bright kitchen, substitute salon. She shot well, she took cheap, and there was no shortage of clients. Now and then brought their 4-legged friends. Who to trim, who to equal, who to wash. I want to register my own kennel." Cindy answered, "Haven't decided which breed to focus on yet. Maybe I will. I just don't know how Betty will feel about them," she grinned. "Betty is a cat too," she clarified. "Aha, he's lived with me for years." Cindy nodded. "Imagine when my father was sick, he used to come to him and the pie whistle right through the window, as if he were at home. He used to walk around the room like that. Very much like our Marcel," smiled Anna. "You know, your sister calls him Betty too." "She does?" Cindy was surprised. "Why does she say it's her cat?" "His name is supposedly Betty, just like yours." "That's odd." Cindy thought with a fist on her chin. So much we have in common and so little. Why is that? Who's going to figure it out? Life is sometimes so complicated that no literature can keep up with it, she said with conviction. I've heard so much from my coworkers while I've been working here. Some days it's ear-splitting. She laughed. Yes, that's true, Cindy agreed. By the way, you never told me why Vanessa was small in that old picture, did you? Anna asked. I will. Do you have time? Anna looked at the clock for another half an hour. I don't think there are any emergencies today, unless there's an emergency. I've got about the same amount of time. Then it's simple enough. My parents' neighbor was an old friend of my grandmother's. They didn't talk for a while, lost touch after moving to the big city, and then they met again by chance and started hanging out. Vanessa's father died when she was still a baby. Heart disease, I think. Not her birth father, of course, her mother's husband. Her birth father was my father. He dated Cindy's mother around the same time as mine. They went back and forth. They couldn't make up their minds about their relationship. One day, he finally decided that Lucy would no longer see my mother. And Wendy soon turned him down. She decided to reconnect with her husband. Only they both ended up pregnant by him. Only my mother found out a few days after my father's accident on the train. He had suffered the exact same injury as Vanessa, falling onto the railroad tracks and out of the car at full throttle. He was trying to protect a girl he didn't know from hooligans. They pushed him out. Jesus, you've gone white, Anna. What a nightmare. And how strange for a daughter to repeat her father's fate. Yes, nodded Cindy. Weirdness abounds in our lives. Anyway, the second woman my father dated, Vanessa, Wendy's mother, discovered her pregnancy much later. She was having some sort of cycle problem, and she was late all the time. Anyway, she realized she was about to become a mother. When my parents were married, my mother quickly took over my father. Cindy grinned sadly, but I still don't know. And I guess I'll never know why she put Chuck on Vanessa's birth certificate as her real father instead of her husband. Maybe she wanted her daughter to know the truth about her birth someday, she suggested. Most likely, Cindy agreed. I think so too, one way or another. But one day my grandmother, visiting a friend of hers, saw little Vanessa in a stroller on the landing and almost screamed in horror. I thought someone had stolen me. That's how she and I were when we were kids. I guess that's what she told her friend. Your neighbor's baby looks like my granddaughter Cindy. 2 peas in a pod. Actually, that's not at all surprising, her buddy chuckled. I've seen your Slavic here a lot lately. He used to visit my neighbor while her husband was away. What are you talking about? My grandmother was amazed and horrified and told me that her son had already become an invalid for 3.5 years after an accident and only moves around in a wheelchair. And the next time I saw my son, I told him about Wendy's child and asked him if this girl could really be his daughter. Maybe, Chuck sighed. God, why didn't she tell me about it? My whole life would have turned out differently then. He'd asked his mother to talk to Wendy if she had the chance. And he asked her to bring Vanessa to him. He wanted to see his other daughter. So she did. And Wendy, a kind soul, told her everything as it happened. And cried for a long time afterward that everything had turned out the way it had. After a while, Wendy, Vanessa, and Grandma came to our house. When my mother left for her advanced training, that was the day that old picture was taken. And I was too young at the time to remember the encounter. A friend of my grandmother's recently told me that on that one meeting with Wendy and Vanessa, my father was so upset that he even got drunk, which never happened to him at all. And my mother came home a couple of days later and had a long argument when she found empty bottles by the trash can. By the way, she knew very well about Wendy and the fact that she also had a daughter by Chuck, but she never told me about it. Even when I showed her that picture, she didn't confess, didn't give it away with a single gesture, not a woman of fortitude. What an interesting story. Anna sighed. Like in the movie? But that doesn't make it any easier for Vanessa and me, Cindy grinned. Besides, I managed to get involved in another story with her husband. But that accident wasn't your fault, Anna said with conviction. Maybe, but somehow I don't feel it. Cindy sighed. But I have to go, she realized. You too. See you later. The girls hugged each other goodbye and went off to their respective jobs. Meanwhile, Vanessa was getting better every day, and she was not regressing at all. Chuck God. Nick with his team in white coats did not leave not a single centimeter on the body of his interesting patient unexamined. And hundreds of typewritten pages had already been written. Several scientific reports had been produced. When one day Vanessa was determined to go home, "I feel fine and want to go home," she informed the doctors. The tests were all good, and no reason was found to keep the girl in the clinic. However, she was asked to come back regularly for checkups. Cindy learned about the upcoming discharge from Anna, of course, and came to help her sister. "Are you sure you should?" Anna asked her. "They won't even let you on our doorstep anymore." "I'm not going into the clinic," Cindy reassured her. "I'll go to the parking lot nearby and help her home. I don't think she'll want to go with someone she doesn't know." Anna said skeptically, "I'll explain everything to her." Cindy was burning with enthusiasm, and it was impossible to dissuade her. On the appointed day of discharge, Vanessa, from the worst, by all accounts healthy, walked out of the clinic with only a small bag. To the doctors who questioned her about where she would go and whether her relatives would come to pick her up, she told them that she remembered the way home perfectly well. She had no relatives. Her mother was alive and well 5 years ago. But since she hasn't come forward in so many years, there's little hope she's alive. Would a normal mother abandon her child in a coma? Everyone agreed that no, of course not, squinting against the bright sun. Vanessa stood, breathing in the spring air and taking in the newly recognized city noise. Somewhere a streetcar was rattling. Cheerful birds were yelling and far from this humble green corner. The noise of the great highway came with a heavy and steady hum. "Vanessa, hello." Toward her suddenly stepped from around the corner of the clinic, the very girl she least wanted to see. "What do you want?" Vanessa asked sharply. "Why are you following me?" "I'm not." Cindy was confused. "I'm your sister," she blurted out, forgetting that she wanted to bring Vanessa up to speed gradually. "My own sister. You and I have the same father," she added hurriedly without giving Vanessa a second thought. "My name is Cindy." "I know your name." Vanessa frowned hostilely. "I know a lot of you in general. From my husband's correspondence." Cindy folded her eyebrows together mournfully and looked at her sister piteously. "You have nothing to complain about." Vanessa grinned and walked forward. "Where is Cindy?" Vanessa shouted pitifully to Cindy from behind. "I'm sorry, please forgive me. It's been a long time since I've dated that creep. Believe me, please." She caught up with her sister and collapsed to her knees in front of her. "Please, I'm sorry." "Oh, please." Vanessa was terrified. Stand up, I'm telling you, please forgive me." Cindy clung to the edge of her clothes. "Come with me. Please, I'll take you home." "How will you get there on your own?" "You will." Squeamishly tugged at the edge of her dress. "I don't want to see you, and I don't want you out of my life." And off she went, getting farther and farther away from her sister. She didn't believe a word the girl said. What other sister would come up with? I bet she did too. It's another one of her boyfriend's schemes. These sorrowful, evil thoughts gave Vanessa new strength, and a bright blush played on her pale cheeks. She strode determinedly toward the subway, almost oblivious to the changes that had taken place in her hometown during the many years she'd been on the edge between this world and the next. Vanessa vaguely remembered bits and pieces of that long-ago tragedy, but she didn't want to remember it. And when another image from the last day of her past life came back to her eyes, she shook her head and squeezed her eyes tightly shut, trying to push those intrusive visions away from her. She had little idea how and with whom she would now live. During the years spent in the clinic, almost no one had visited her, though at times some vague images surfaced, as if from a long-forgotten dream. There is her mother, sitting by her bedside and crying. Vanessa herself looked at herself and her mother from a height, as if her soul had separated from her body, and was floating light as a balloon filled with gas under the ceiling of the room. And that other Vanessa, doomed henceforth on the floor vegetable existence, lies on her back, closed her eyes to the chin, covered with a white sheet, and from all sides to her stretched, long scholarly, threads of wires, like predatory thin snakes, ready to suck all the vital juices. She also remembered the constant bitter cold. She was freezing, terribly cold, and she had somehow informed those around her that she was terribly cold. Let them cover her body with a thick blanket, but no one understood it. And gradually the coldness that Vanessa Holt penetrated to the farthest corners. Her desolation of soul seeped into her brain, and all vision ceased. Only occasionally they broke through the shaky veil in which she hung, like a caterpillar in such a gray cocoon. Someone's unfamiliar voices. Everything changed when in that gray, shaky saw. One day I saw a tiny, tiny little light. It was very warm, this tiny fire ray, warm and somehow fuzzy. And Vanessa was not afraid to burn herself in it. On the contrary, every cell of her cocooned, motionless body reached for it with all its strength. Sometimes the light disappeared, and then a rippling gray shroud. It moved ever closer, made denser and angrier, and sprouted inside Vanessa, covered her mouth and nose, preventing her from breathing. She tried to scream, to call out for that little fire, not even knowing what to call it, but she screamed and heard only the echo of her own shameless scream. The fire responded to her mute cry and came back, and with each time it returned, she breathed easier and easier. The gray veil was receding. Vanessa gradually began to see the real world through it. One day she even heard someone's voice again for the first time in a long time. An unfamiliar young woman called Vanessa to her for a long time, telling her what exactly Vanessa could not remember now. But she remembered the woman's voice, and unpleasantly so. Marveled today, finding out that this voice belonged to her husband's mistress, Wormstan. Another dry, metallic voice broke into the memory, and she stood up hurriedly, adjusting her dress, and stepped out of her station. Not much had changed here. Same warm orange slabs, same platform. Only the signage had changed. Yes, in the middle of the lobby there was a big round stand with some incomprehensible scheme. She made the usual movement, without looking at the signs, turned in the right direction, and went upstairs. Through automatically dissolved congestion and further on the crosswalk. Then a right, a turn, another turn. And there's the hometown courtyard. The new code lock on the iron front door was a little disconcerting. But then someone came out, and Vanessa went inside, breathed in the smell of the pure smoke of that Eve concrete floor. They always cleaned themselves in the entryway. Tenants and schedules were hanging in the stairwells. Taking the elevator up to her floor, Vanessa stopped puzzled in front of her apartment door. It was different, not the battered, thin wooden river that Vanessa remembered from her earliest childhood, but a thick metal one, with a fat grate and most importantly a different lock. Confused, Vanessa moved near this new hostile door that didn't want to let her in and slowed down a bit. Determinedly, she pressed the bell button, which thankfully did not change. Who's there? A suspicious female voice sounded from behind the door, followed by a loud baby crying. What do you want? The woman asked irritably. I opened the door a little on the chain. I was confused. I live here. I see, smirked the woman. Another freak. How many of you are junkies? Some of you have been walking in shambles. Some of you are crooks. And now you're sick from the asylum. I don't know where you live, but not here. Goodbye. And the woman quickly slammed the door shut. Vanessa stood in her own entryway, dazed and confused, and tears came to her eyes. Where to go now? What had happened to the apartment? Where was her mother? What had happened to her? One could try, of course, to go to the other apartment where she lived with her husband. But Vanessa didn't want to do that at all. Shortly before the accident that fateful day, they had had a terrible fight with him. Vanessa did not remember why, but she felt that her husband would not be happy with her. And she was not eager to see him. For the last 2 weeks before her accident, she had been living here in her mother's apartment. What had happened? Gathering herself a little, Vanessa stepped away from that iron door and headed for the apartment. Across the hall, their good neighbor Aunt Wendy had once lived there. Maybe she would know where her mother was and what was going on here. Oh my God! The neighbor shook her hands. Is that you, Vanessa? I am Wendy, hugging her, the girl replied. What do you mean? Her ears unintentionally read the old woman, wiping away tears of joy. What are we doing at the door? She realized it. Come on in, come on in. Where's my mom? Do you know? Asked Vanessa. walking into the cramped kitchen, and sat down at her usual long-standing place by the window to squeeze between the table and the sill. "Oh, how the source gave it all, my dear, you my neighbor wept. And your mother?" "Oh," she sighed again, "your mother is nowhere to be found." "What do you mean?" Vanessa asked mournfully, no longer expecting anything good from life. "Just like that," said the neighbor. "For about 3 years now." "How did she disappear?" "They say some cult got involved." "They sold her apartment to someone." "Who sold it?" Vanessa asked tiredly. "I don't know." The neighbor was sad. "What about you?" Vanessa answered sadly. "Consider now that there is nowhere to go." "Oh," my grandmother Wendy sympathized. "But wait, your sister came to me several times." "You found your own sister." "You don't know." "I know," Vanessa replied sluggishly, and yawned. The strength that only a little while ago had been boiling in her with anger had now completely left her, and she wanted to sleep uncontrollably. She didn't remember as the caring Wendy laid her down on the couch, covered her with a plaid, and quietly at the critter at the door went back into the kitchen. Dialed her fingers into the buttons of the phone, looking for Cindy's number, and said to the one, "Come to me, your sister showed up alive." She must have been released from the hospital. It's a miracle. Aha, she's got nowhere to go. Her mother is nowhere to be found. Somebody's privatized the apartment. An hour later, Cindy was already in Aunt Wendy's apartment and sat next to Vanessa, who was asleep, wondering how she could convince her sister that she didn't want to hurt her. Upon waking up, the first thing Vanessa saw in front of her was a glass of water standing on a stool. She picked it up and took it away, setting it back down. Saw an old photograph lying next to it. Vanessa picked it up and saw some strangers. An elderly, smiling woman sitting on a couch. Next to her stands and a girl of about 4 years old. And then there's a man with beautiful hair, dark curly, but sitting in a wheelchair and in his lap. Vanessa shrieked softly, taking a closer look. It's her. She recognized herself when she turned the picture over and saw the inscription on the back. Me, Chuck, Cindy, and Vanessa. And the year is signed. But she's definitely 4 and a bit. Her mother had pictures of her like this. Wondering where Aunt Wendy had gotten this picture from, Vanessa got up and left the room for the kitchen, where she found Aunt Wendy herself, and again that awful girl who had been harassing her outside the clinic. "Hi," Cindy smiled. "You're awake at last, and we're frying cutlets. Go home, we're having dinner." For some reason, Vanessa didn't find it. What can I say to those simple words? She turned around on automatic, went to the bathroom, washed up. She went back to the kitchen, sat down next to Cindy, ate cutlets and mashed potatoes, which were very tasty, and as if waking up, asked Aunt Wendy, "Who is she?" Nodding towards Cindy, "Your sister," answered her babka. "Your father's kin." That evening, the 3 of them sat in the tiny kitchen talking for a long time before dawn broke. And the next morning, Vanessa and Cindy left Aunt Wendy's hospitable apartment and went willingly to her newly acquired sister. The young women began to live together. The red-haired Cindy Betty had taken Vanessa in as if she were family. It was as if she was just going away for a while. And now she's back. "Look, I've got to pick up mine," Betty told Vanessa to her sister. "In a few days. Do you mind?" "No, of course not," smiled Cindy. "We'll go and pick it up today. I'll pick you up after work, and we'll go to the clinic." Good, Vanessa smiled. She had gotten a little used to having a sister these past few days. And having listened to their story, she despaired with her heart and forgave Ira her involuntary sin. Told her about her life, how she and her mother lived together. Good night, indecisive and susceptible to the influence of others to a woman. Wendy, unsure her mother was constantly deceiving. She'd believe a man in public, and he'd cheat on her and steal from her. Yeah, I've had my share of that. A few brief encounters with her father. Vanessa didn't remember either. Neither did her sister. Only one she remembered forever. One day, an elderly woman she didn't know rang the doorbell of her and her mother's apartment. Vanessa, then a 10th grader, opened the door and saw her and a small red kitten. The woman handed her the fluffy lump and said, "This is for you, Vanessa, from your father," and said nothing more. She went away. Vanessa did not tell her mother any of this, but only lied that she had found the kitten in the entrance. She didn't even understand who the old woman with the kitten was and why she had told her about her father. Vanessa only knew about her father that he had died a long time ago when she was still a little girl. Gradually, that encounter faded into the far recesses of her memory, but the kitten remained. They named him Betty, and very quickly he grew into a huge, fluffy one. The cat loved Vanessa, followed her around like a dog, and when she got married and moved in with her husband, he followed her too. True, the husband, I'm sure, did not love him and did not even try to hide it. Every now and then offended Betty, kicked and chased him away from everywhere. In return, the cat took revenge on the offender. That in his shoes he put gifts, then in the closet climbs, and all the laundry comes out and picks up. Finally, the man got fed up with it. So he just threw the cat away, while Vanessa was out. When she came back, she sobbed and begged her husband to give Cusa back, but he was adamant that it was either me or this monster. Choose. He told her. What was there to do? True, she still went to look for Betty. She called for him, but he never came back. And how did he miraculously find her after all these years in the Brain Institute ward? The sisters found no logical explanation for this fact. But two ginger cats and both Betty soon began to live together, as did the girls themselves. Hey, I think I'm getting it, don't you? Said Cindy one day. It must have been or rather, our grandmother who came to see you then. My father said that his friend's cat had a lot of kittens in her memory. They just didn't know where to put them, and they were all gingers. Apparently, yours are my siblings. Apparently, Vanessa agreed. What a life of coincidences, and they both laughed out loud. A few months had passed since the sisters had so unexpectedly found each other and connected. One day, Cindy came home from work not alone, but with a friend and introduced her to her sister as a good lawyer. She's already helped me more than once. Remember I told you when I was trying to track you down? Yes, Vanessa nodded. Come on in, I'm just getting ready. I want Emily. Cindy nodded at her lawyer friend. To help you and me find your mother and figure out what we can do to get your apartment back. Is that possible? Vanessa doubted. It's been so many years. We need to make inquiries. Look at the documents, Emily replied. Maybe there's more to the story, given your extraordinary situation. Did they give you your passport when you were discharged? Yes, replied Vanessa. My passport is fine, Emily smiled. Something's already hit her. She and her colleagues got to work. And soon there was already some information. The apartment that Vanessa had lent Vanessa was in the Municipal Housing Fund. Turned out to be privatized by some strangers, unraveling the tangle further. Lawyers have established that Vanessa's mother had checked out of this apartment 4 years before the present day and left to an unknown place, and instead of her in the apartment registered Vanessa's husband. Vanessa herself was discharged a year later by court order as being in a state incompatible with life. Then he divorced her and privatized the apartment for himself, and a duplicate. The certificate of divorce Emily obtained and brought to her sisters. How could this have happened? Cindy was indignant. Emily grinned very easily and simply. Everything is within the law. Vanessa said nothing, just sat quietly in her chair, her lips trembling. Baby, come on, it's okay. Cindy put her arm around her sister and stroked her cheek affectionately. We'll nail him yet. You'll see. Yes, yes, agreed Vanessa. I think we have a good chance of getting your apartment back through the courts, said Emily Vanessa. I'll need a power of attorney for representation. Are you okay with that? Of course she agrees, answered Cindy for her upset sister. We'll do it tomorrow. It took almost a year of litigation to prove an obvious fact. Vanessa is the rightful owner of the apartment. She is alive and well, and intends, with the help of criminal machinations of her ex-husband, deprived of the only housing. Everyone they could think of has been invited to the trial. Wendy's aunt and doctors from the Brain Institute, where Vanessa spent the last years in a coma, as well as several of her old friends and acquaintances. Cindy came forward as a witness, who told about her relationship with her sister's ex-husband, and described him as an unscrupulous, cruel man and a clever swindler. In parallel, another chain of events came to light. Suddenly, it happened right in court. Vanessa remembered that terrible evening when she had flown out of the train carriage. She had screamed terribly and slumped to the floor without feeling. Everyone jumped up from their seats. An ambulance was called. A brake was called and Vanessa was taken to the hospital. When she came to herself, crying indignantly, she told her sister sitting next to her that she remembered who exactly pushed her out of the train. Of course, her worst suspicions were justified. It was none other than her ex-husband. A week or two before I told him I was pregnant, Vanessa told Cindy. He was so angry. It was horrible. He started yelling that I wanted to ruin my life for him, that he had told me 100 times that he didn't want to raise any snotty kids, that I needed an abortion right away, and other horrible things. God, how upset was I. We had a big fight, and I went to my mother's apartment, which he then so brazenly took away. Then he called and said we had to meet, that he'd changed his mind and would wait for me in a vacation home near Washington. We'll spend an unforgettable week there, we'll make up and discuss everything properly. I believed him like a fool. I got on the train and went, where he was supposed to meet me at the station. About halfway through the journey, and a young girl came into my carriage, so pretty, and said that someone was waiting for me in the next carriage. I wondered who could be waiting for me there, and she said it was a surprise, and she smiled so cordially and openly. I followed her. We went out into the vestibule, and then someone shoved me in the back, and the vestibule door was open for some reason. I flew out at full speed, and all I remember is turning around before I fell and seeing from that ugly, smirking, grimacing face of my husband. God, what kind of person would you have to be to create such a thing? Did you wipe your eyes? Cindy, oh my darling, I want to bang him like a cockroach for everything he's done to you. Come on, darling. Vanessa told her calmly. I'm sure he'll get the punishment he deserves. Vanessa was quite right. The lawyers from Lenina's company got Vanessa's closed criminal case for attempted murder reopened and put out a search for Vanessa's ex-husband. He was soon found and turned out to be a long-wanted man. A marriage scammer who married, eliminated his wives out of the way, and took possession of their property. The question remained, what had he done with Vanessa's mother? So they started looking for traces of her, and all the same they found the same swindler with whom Vanessa had connected her life. He founded and maintained an entire sectarian colony of women whose psyche was skillfully treated with various techniques and narcotic substances to break them. These unfortunates lived in one of the abandoned villages, where they languished daily simplifying their flesh, having previously parted with their property in one way or another. Among the other unfortunates found Severina's mother, almost no longer remembering herself. She was rescued from this captivity and placed in a clinic for rehabilitation. Vanessa's ex-husband was found to have a lot of real estate, registered both in his name and in the names of several reliable people. All of these individuals made up an entire organized crime group, now exposed and placed in a place not so remote. The loot was returned to its former owners, if possible, and what there was no one to return was sold at auction, compensated the victims. Vanessa was also paid a fair amount of money, and she moved back into her old apartment. The sisters, who had become very close friends over the last year of their new confident life, kept their sibling relationship intact, and they even played their wedding on the same day. Marrying two brothers they met at the New Year's Eve skating rink in the park. And the most amazing thing is that they got pregnant at the same time and gave birth to wonderful daughters one day apart. Vanessa and Cindy were happy that their destinies intertwined, and they both received from fate what they dreamed of. And they didn't need anything more in their lives.